Here since 1950, and people still call me a newcomer. And I guess discovering the history of Baytown has been a great delight to me. When Sarah mentioned the Cat 1, I came here in September of 1950. I'm a Dallas gal, and everybody told me, don't bother to get your winter clothes down here. We never have a winter. 1951, I guess, was the coldest year that I have ever seen in my life, and I didn't listen to a soul. I went ahead and had my clothes sent down here. There was more ice in the city of Baytown than I think there'd ever been in the history of Baytown. But that first December that I was here, I was so amazed to see this unit out in the plant with the Christmas tree on it, the lights with the Christmas tree. In 1951, they said that if you came here to work in the city of Baytown and you were a single gal and you worked for Western Union, you always met some man in Baytown and got married. That happened to me. I did that too. So I stayed on in Baytown instead of being transferred out like I was supposed to have been. I came here for a vacation relief for 2 weeks. The manager quit, I became the manager, I just stayed here, and I'm still here. After Pete and I married, and one of the trips my family liked to make with the children was to come to Baytown and see that tall Christmas tree. So Baytown has a lot of things that were fun. When I arrived on the bus, they hollered Baytown, and I started to get off. That was in 1950, and they said, no, the driver said, no, you don't want to go to Baytown. You want to go to Goose Creek. And I said, oh, no, I don't. I want to go to Baytown. And he said, well, this is not Baytown. You want to go over to Goose Creek, and that's Goose Creek, Baytown. Well, you know, I said, how far is it over there? And he said, well, it's about 5 miles. And I said, I'll tell you what, Buster, if I get over there and that's not where I'm supposed to go, you're going to bring me back over here on the bus. And I meant that, just that. And I had a reservation at the Del Monte Hotel, and I said, where is the Del Monte Hotel? And he said, it's in Goose Creek. I said, okay, they've made a mistake. So I went on and got off the bus in Goose Creek, and everything was just fun. I was at the right place. Well, you know, when you're in a place that's Goose Creek, Baytown, and Pelly, and you're working for Western Union, and you're getting these telegrams in, and you're trying to figure out all these streets, and they still came in, Goose Creek, Baytown, and Pelly. That's the way they were. But they all got routed here just the same. Well, I had to fast learn about this city. But this was a very cohesive little town, and I loved it. There was an excitement about it, especially every 2 weeks on Texas Avenue. And my office was right on Asheville. It didn't take me long to find out when payday was in Baytown, because everything in Baytown was working alive, and every store on Texas Avenue was filled. There was not a vacancy. The streets were so safe I could put the deposit under my arm and just swish up Texas Avenue to the First National Bank and make a deposit, just swinging this bag just like I didn't know I had any money in it. But I made a mistake one day. I went up there, deposited my money, and I came back, and right in front of the economy store, I got put in jail. In a stockade. It was Go Texas Day, and the JCs were dead serious, let me tell you, that if you didn't have on something Western, you got put in this stockade right there on the street. And nobody told me that they were that forceful about it. I just had the deposit. I didn't have my purse. I didn't have any money. And I was fined. And I couldn't get out. Until I finally found some brave soul that would go over to the office, tell the employee over there to please come bail me out. And the longer you stayed in, the more it cost. I thought it was going to take my whole week's salary before they got through with me. But this was fun. One thing, Fred Hartman just nearly drove me crazy when I first came here, because the tunnel was being built. And he didn't miss not one rivet or whatever they put in that thing to put it under the water until he had to send a story on it. And he always sent it by Western Union. I sent press on the tunnel until I should know everything about it. But that was one of the highlights that was happening. This was progress that was happening in this town. They wanted me to open up at night if they had a night game to send press on a football game. And I was so young and eager to be part of the city, I did it. I just fell in with the rest of them, came down here whenever the game was over with and sent the press. So I fell in with them just like they did in the 1930s when the Chamber of Commerce president said the only way Goose Creek is ever going to be on the map is have a winning football team. And they closed this town every Friday, every store emptied out, and they went to the game because there was no lights, and we're still that way. We still support our schools and our football, and everything is, but we've lost some of our cohesiveness. I think the mall is great, but I miss Texas Avenue. I miss Rufus Honeycutt in the theater, in the old theater down there. I worked a split shift when I first came here, worked in the morning, worked in the afternoon. Sure was nice to go over to the theater to kill a little time. I lived out on Wright Boulevard and I walked to work. I didn't always want to walk back. But this was a town that made you feel welcome. The merchants were fun to work with. Downtown was fun. We had a special restaurant that we had a cup of coffee. Or you ducked into Scarborough's Pharmacy at their little snack bar and you had a cup of coffee and a sandwich. Or across the street in that old cash register at Herring's Drugstore is in our gift shop. And when we get out of that building and into the big one, it will be on the floor. A wealth of history is housed in such a small space as our little museum. I hope someday the people of Goose Creek, Baytown, and Pelly will consider me an old-timer. Because, let me tell you, I'm beginning to feel sort of old. And when Sarah keeps pointing, get ready, Gene, somebody, and I hope it's Laura or Bobby, is going to have to take y'all's place. And it's not going to be long. I thank you very much.
Oh, I enjoyed each and every one of our panelists. They were wonderful. But the evening is not over yet because we have until 9 o'clock, and now's the fun time when we invite some of you to come up and add your remembrances or anecdotes or anything that you want to talk about and add it to our record of the evening. Would someone like to come up? And I hope you won't be bashful. I know we have the president.
I want to say something.
Ray, come up here.
There, though. Gene mentioned the book, The History of Baytown. If there's anybody in this room that wants one and doesn't have one, there's a sale right out there. $21. That's it.
Thank you, Ray. Is there anything else you want to add? Ray is the current president, is that right, of the historical? Is it?
We came in 1943, right after a terrible hurricane. We had just sold a lovely home in Breckenridge, and there wasn't any going back. So we rented a little place, apartment here, because the place we had intended to be in was off the foundation. The hurricane saw about that, you see. So we were quite concerned, but we were here, and we were going to make the best of it. And the first night we were here, I just came out of a deep sleep and thought, oh, what in the world is that on my coat? And it was the first roach I had ever seen. Very first one.
I can see why you'd remember that. Oh, is there anybody else who would come up? Yes, please.
I just want to
say a little word about some things that I think ought to go in the museum sometime or another. How many of you remember the old community building, old Humble Community Building? Well, you remember when it was tore down and demolished, they auctioned off a bunch of the stuff that was in there, all the things. Well, I don't know how many of y'all remember, but in the big lobby part, there was 4 good long tables, about 8 feet long, about 3.5 feet wide, built out of solid black walnut. They're about so high. You could sit on them, you could lay down on them, you could do anything you wanted to, but they was sold at that auction. Well, our family bought 2 of those, and they're now, I offered them to the museum over one time right after the storm, and we had no place over there to keep them. So we donated them to Grace Methodist Church, and they're in use over there now, and they belong to the church. But if and when things get where they could be done, and museums should like to have them, I believe that the church would consider letting the museum have them on some terms. I don't have any idea what, but I believe they would. And any time that the museum wants it and can make that arrangement, it can be done with my blessings.
I came to Goose Creek, Baytown, Pelly, about 1946. Prior to that time, I was with the Internal Revenue Station in Houston. I recall that Humble contacted our office and said, would you folks send some employees down to help with the income tax returns? So I was the supervisor in charge of training personnel, so they said get some of your boys together to go to Baytown, Goose Creek and Pelly and help with tax returns. We came down to the community building and set up there and prepared tax returns for the employees. I became tired of routing them to this one and that one and another, and I decided they're having too much fun. I'm going to make them out myself. So I got over, and an employee came over to me. I recall he was a Latin American. And I started with the top line, your name, your address, and got down to the children. Well, I said, see supplemental page attached. And he had a list of them. But anyway, when he come to his occupation, I said, what is your occupation? He said, well, I don't know what you call it. Now, let me tell you what I do. He said, they give me a stick with a nail on the end of it, and I go around over the property and I pick up paper and I put it in a sack. And that's what I do. Well, I put down maintenance employee, and then he handed me his W-2. I looked at that W-2 at what he was making. I vividly remembered what is on my W-2. And that rascal was making more money than I was making. Walking around with a stick and a nail in it. I went back, that was before March the 15th. I told my wife, I'm leaving the Internal Revenue. She said, what are you going to do? I said, I don't know, but I'm moving to Goose Creek. There has to be something down there that would make more money than the Internal Revenue if it doesn't put a stick with a nail in it. So we moved out. Well, it's been a wonderful experience living here. I was on your city council for 6 years, back right after the inauguration. I'm like most of the other Goose Creeks. I legally lived in 3 different towns in 1 year without ever moving out of the same house. Goose Creek, Pelly, and then Baytown. I recall old man E. Hunter was our city manager. He tells of an experience he had there. He was city manager of Goose Creek when they were incorporated, and we later made him judge. And he tells of his employees there in the water department. He insisted that before they leave, everything had to balance out. Well, it's right there at the first. Some of them would stay until after 6 o'clock trying to balance the cash. But first thing you know, they got good. By 5 minutes after 5, they were gone. And he got to thinking, you know, they're really improving. However, one day he was in and he found a little coffee can under the counter. He opened it up and it was about half full of money. He said, well, what is this? Finally, what knew what I'd say. Finally, he said, now listen, I want to know what's that coffee can, what's he doing with the money. Well, finally, one of the girls said, well, that's our balancer. When we're over, it's the coffee can. When we're short, it's the coffee can. So that's our balancer here. Well, you know, we all need balancers sometimes. Whether it be coffee can, whether it be a mate or whatever it may be. And as you look back over the towns, I was here, Gene, in that winter you're talking about. That was the coldest one winter I ever went through. And as we go back over the experiences, I think all of us from Baytown and Goose Creek and Petty have been brought closer together by experiences and heritage that have been ours to enjoy.
Thank you. That was Milton Campbell, and we enjoyed hearing what you had to say. Anybody else? Would someone else like to come up? Gwen? This is Gwen Altwine. Come on. Yes. It's easier on people to hear.
I remember people more than anything. And I guess because I was a child and it was different where I came from. It was a larger town in Sherman, Texas. So when I saw these people and the way the town took care of them, their cohesiveness, I mean, we liked them. But there was a man called Jeff. And when Jeff said hello, he didn't say hello. He'd say, kill a bear. You remember Jeff? And everyone looked out for Jeff. And then there was a man named Gopher. Now, Gopher tipped the bottle a little bit too heavily. And Gopher would go to sleep on the street. And if we saw that part of him was in the street, we kids would gently move him over. He wasn't arrested. People looked out for him. And I remember the kindness that was directed towards these people. Also, I remember a dog named Bill. Does anybody remember a dog named Bill that was a Dalmatian? Part Dalmatian. Was she part Dalmatian? The Mr. and Mrs. Paul U. Lee's dog. I worked at Black's Pharmacy. And every day about the same time, Belle would come in and she would just sit down and stare. And the girl behind the fountain knew that Belle came for her ice cream. And they would put a pint, or what is it, half a pint, about this tall, that had a little metal handle. You remember those that you carried it by? And they would fill that with her favorite flavor, which I don't know what that was. But they would close it and they would hand it to Belle and she would take the little metal thing in her mouth and she would strike out for the funeral home. And then I found out later that Mrs. Paul U. Lee would dump it in her bowl and then she would eat it, but she would never stop on the way home to eat her ice cream. And I remember Eddie Cleveland. That's when I would go down to Eddie's and I would sit on, I guess it was a counter, but he arranged the magazines where you would be able to sit on them while you read the funny books. And as long as we behaved ourselves, we could sit there and read the funny books and we didn't have to buy them. So that, I remember people more than anything. And I remember the big hurricane in 1942, 3, and how everyone pulled together. I mean, it was really great. So that's what impresses me, the people and the friendliness and the way they held together. But especially how we looked after someone unfortunate like Jeff and Gopher.
Would anybody else like to come up?
I'd like to say something. I noticed all this and maybe I'm maybe born and raised here. My name's Peter Arthur. And I've noticed a lot of work has been done by non-Indians. And I want to thank these people. They have helped us very much. And you appreciate that because these people moved in here, they didn't have the commissions, and it hadn't been done by natives that helped too, but I have recognized so many non-natives and I just want to thank them.
Much appreciated by the so-called newcomers. Anybody else have anything to say? Uh-huh.
I'll tell a little bit about my young years in Baytown. My father was Eddie Bynum, who I'm sure a lot of you older people remember. We lived here several times, but I was a little girl here in the early 30s when the commissary was still used for the groceries. And I can remember when we quit going to the commissary and went to the A&P, and Mr. Broom was the manager. Anybody remember Mr. Broom? We lived in a little house down near the tennis courts when I was little, and the biggest excitement in the world was to run in the backyard when the interurban went by. And I guess the interurban died out about the time of the war. But we moved away in 1936, so all these memories are really way back. I remember going to kindergarten in Goose Creek to a Mrs. Jones, and she taught us the most useful thing in the world, which was to learn to curtsy. That's the only thing we learned in kindergarten, was to learn to curtsy. The little boys learned to bow. And then I guess I went to Baytown Elementary, where Miss O'Grady and Miss Day taught. Trying to think what else would have been memories of those years. I remember the security man that used to ride the horse around the perimeters of the refinery. And for a long time I could remember his name. I can see him yet, but I can't think of his name. We lived at that time in a two-story house at Catacorn from the refinery, near the Harrops and Dr. Pipkin. And I guess everything's gone now from that area. But my folks moved back later on, but I never did live here again after that. Later, in very recent times like today, I have been going to the same beauty shop for years and years, and the lady that goes before me is named Mary Lou Smith. And one time we got to talking, and she said, well, I lived in Baytown way, way back. And I said, well, I did too, way, way, way back. And she said, well, I'm older than you, and I had a dancing school. And I said, well, a lot of my little friends took dancing. And she said, I was Miss Duffy. Does anybody ever take from Miss Duffy? I guess she moved in the mid-30s too. But all my little friends took dancing from Miss Duffy, and she's still going strong. Well, my name is Madeline Klossman now, and I've lived in Houston a long time, but I was Bynum.
Great, thank you.
You lived in the company edition?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Several
I
times.
call us the company press.
We had
Do we have some more reminiscences? Ernestine, you have anything to add? Okay.
Audrey, I do think this is one of the better programs that we've had.
Well,
I really do.
I was just thinking as people were talking, we started this series with growing up in Baytown, and it was wonderful. It was a warm, exciting evening, and I thought, I'm just so pleased with the scheduling that we ended with this group, because it sort of has the same feeling, and it's really neat. It's a nice way to start and to wrap up the series. Well, if there's nothing else to add, I want to thank all of the participants for tonight and all of you who came up and who attended. And I also want to thank everyone who had anything to do with this series. It's been really fun, and we really do appreciate your help. Thank you. Thank you so
Well,
much.
thank you for inviting me.
Glad to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, it was so neat.
I really think we lost our